After I saved a woman from a house fire, she asked, "Can I go back inside now?" That's funny. I set her down on the lawn where the paramedics were waiting. I'm serious. I want to go back. She tried to stand up, but her legs were shaky from smoke inhalation. Why would you want to do that? I pulled off my helmet, confused by her urgency. I left my family in there. Her eyes were wild with panic. Excuse me, what? I grabbed my radio immediately. I have to go back. I left my family in there. She was crying now and trying to push past me toward the burning house. I called for backup while physically blocking her path. The house was fully engulfed with flames shooting through the roof. We'd done a sweep of the main floor and found only her passed out in the living room. But if there were more people inside, especially in areas we hadn't checked yet, we needed to move fast. My captain arrived with 3 other firefighters. I explained the situation while the woman kept sobbing about her family being trapped inside. She said they were in the basement where she'd been doing laundry when the fire started. She'd run upstairs to get help, but got overwhelmed by smoke. We geared up for another entry. The structure was compromised, but if there were victims inside, we had to try. The woman gave us details about the basement layout and where her family might be. She mentioned hearing them crying when she left, which made my blood run cold. There was no time to waste. Walker and I went in first while Hensley and Kirk waited as backup. The smoke was thicker now and visibility was basically zero. We felt our way to the basement door, which was already warm to the touch. Not a good sign. The stairs creaked under our weight, and I wondered if they'd hold. Halfway down we heard it. Crying sounds coming from somewhere below. My heart raced as we pushed forward. A family was trapped down here, and we were their only hope. The smoke was less dense in the basement, but the heat was intense. Something was very wrong with this fire pattern. We reached the bottom and started searching. The crying seemed to be coming from the back corner near what looked like a storage area. Boxes and old furniture blocked our path. We started moving things aside, working as fast as we could. The crying got louder as we got closer. That's when the stairs collapsed behind us. The whole structure just gave way in a shower of sparks and burning timber. Walker called it in immediately. We were trapped, but we could hear victims just ahead. No firefighter would leave civilians behind, even if it meant risking our own lives. We kept pushing through the debris. The crying was constant now, and sounded like multiple voices, including what seemed like a baby. How could anyone survive down here this long without proper air? The smoke was getting thicker, and my air gauge was dropping. Fast. Finally, we reached the source. Walker pulled aside an old dresser, and we both froze. There on the floor was a family of dolls. Baby dolls. Child dolls. Even adult-sized mannequins dressed in clothes. They were arranged like a real family having dinner at a small table. Realizing that there was no way out, Walker said, "It's been an honor serving with you all." I stared at the plastic faces while my brain tried to make sense of what we'd risked our lives for. Walker grabbed his radio and called out our exact position to whoever was listening above us, while I kept looking at those dolls sitting around their little table with their fake food and frozen smiles. The smoke was getting thicker, and I could feel it starting to burn through my mask even with the filter working. My captain's voice came through the radio loud and clear, declaring a mayday for 2 firefighters trapped in the basement, and within seconds we could hear boots running across the floor above us, making the whole ceiling shake. Walker moved closer to me, and we both pressed ourselves into the corner trying to save what little air we had left in our tanks. I checked my gauge and saw the needle sitting just below the 5-minute mark, which made my stomach drop, because that wasn't enough time for them to cut through the floor and get us out. Walker started feeling along the walls, looking for any weak spots we might be able to break through, while I scanned the basement for anything that looked like an exit we might have missed. The heat was getting so bad that my gear felt like it was melting onto my skin, and every breath I took felt like swallowing fire. That's when I spotted a small window well up near the ceiling, but it had thick metal bars across it, and even if we could somehow get the bars off, the opening was way too narrow for either of us to squeeze through. Walker saw where I was looking, and raised his flashlight up to mark the spot so maybe the guys outside would see the light and know where we were. The temperature kept climbing, and I could feel sweat pouring down my back, making my gear stick to me like wet cement. I made the choice to stay right next to Walker, instead of wasting air looking for exits that probably didn't exist anyway. We sat down back to back and started tapping each other's shoulder every 30 seconds, just to make sure we were both still awake and breathing. My air gauge kept dropping, and I tried not to look at it, but I couldn't help checking every few seconds, like somehow it would magically refill itself. Then we heard the most beautiful sound in the world, which was drilling and sawing coming from directly above us, as the RIT team started cutting through the floor. Someone yelled down, asking if we could hear them, and Walker shouted back that we had maybe 3 minutes of air left between us. I waved my flashlight up through the smoke, hoping they could see it, and figure out exactly where we were sitting. The sawing got louder, and chunks of wood and plaster started falling down around us as they worked to make a hole big enough to pull us through. They got Walker first, since he was sitting closer to where they'd broken through, and I watched his boots disappear, up through the smoke, while my low air alarm started that awful beeping that meant I had less than a minute left. I tried to stay calm and count my breaths like they taught us in training, but my heart was pounding, so hard I thought it might explode. Then I felt strong hands grab my arms, and suddenly I was pulled up through the floor, into air that was still hot, but at least it wasn't as thick with smoke. They dragged me across the floor and out the front door, and the second we hit fresh air, my legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the grass. The paramedics were on me immediately, putting an oxygen mask over my face and checking my vitals while I lay there trying to remember how to breathe normally again. Through the mask, I could see the woman fighting against 2 other paramedics and screaming that her family was still inside the house and they had to go get them. The captain had to help hold her back while she kept crying and reaching toward the house where flames were now shooting through what was left of the roof. The whole thing felt like some kind of nightmare, where nothing made sense, because we'd almost died trying to save a bunch of toys while this woman acted like they were real people. After a few minutes, when I could finally stand up without feeling like I was going to pass out, the captain pulled me aside for a quick debrief. He said something had felt wrong about the fire pattern from the very beginning, and he wanted my full report on everything that happened down there. But first, I needed to get checked out at the hospital to make sure the smoke hadn't done any permanent damage to my lungs. Walker was already being loaded into an ambulance, and I could see him giving me a thumbs up through the back window, which made me feel a little better about the whole mess. The woman was still screaming about her family, while the paramedics tried to sedate her and get her into their own ambulance. I kept thinking about those dolls down there melting in the heat, and how she'd sent us down there to die for them, like they were worth more than our lives. My throat felt raw, and every breath hurt, but at least I was breathing, which was more than I thought would happen when that low air alarm started going off in the basement. The paramedics loaded me into the ambulance and started checking my oxygen levels, while I kept hearing those crying sounds echoing in my head. My blood pressure was high and my hands wouldn't stop shaking, but the medic said that was normal after breathing that much smoke and going through that kind of stress. The ambulance ride felt like it took forever with every bump in the road, making my chest hurt worse. At the hospital, they wheeled me into the emergency room, where Walker was already on the gurney next to mine getting an IV started. We locked eyes for a second, and I could see he was thinking the same thing I was about what we'd found down there, but neither of us said anything about his comment. The nurses kept coming in to check our oxygen levels and give us breathing treatments that tasted like metal. They moved us to a regular room after a few hours when our vitals stabilized. That night, I kept waking up every 20 minutes to crying sounds that made my heart pound until I realized it was just the IV pump beeping. The nurse came in 3 times to check on me and kept saying the beeping was normal, but I knew what I was really hearing wasn't mechanical. I gave up trying to sleep around 4 in the morning and just stared at the ceiling. Fire Marshal Catherine Wiley showed up at 8 with a digital recorder and asked if I felt up to talking about what happened. She pulled a chair close to my bed and started asking questions about every single detail from when we first arrived at the scene. Her questions were all about facts, like what time we got there and which door we entered through and how long it took to find the woman. She wanted to know exactly what the woman said about her family and whether she gave us specific locations. There's something really strange about those dolls being arranged, like a family having dinner in the basement. Why would someone set that up so carefully and then act like they're real people who need rescuing? I told her everything I could remember while she took notes and recorded it all. Then she pulled out her phone and played me Walker's statement from earlier that morning. His voice sounded rough from the smoke, but steady, until he got to the part about thinking we were going to die. When he explained that saying it was an honor was just his way of dealing with thinking we wouldn't make it out, his voice cracked, and I had to look away. Catherine stopped the recording and pulled up the original 911 call on her tablet. Underneath the woman's panicked voice telling the operator about the fire, you could hear these faint crying sounds in the background that repeated every few seconds. She asked if that matched what we heard in the basement, and I nodded, because it was exactly the same pattern. That afternoon, she drove me back to the scene in her department vehicle. The house was nothing but black timbers and ash with yellow tape around the whole lot. She had a folder full of photos from the scene, including close-ups of the doll arrangement we'd found. In the daylight, with their clothes burned and their plastic faces melted into weird shapes, they looked even worse than I remembered. She showed me how several of the dolls had these little sound boxes inside them that would make crying noises when they got hot or moved. The technical explanation made sense, but it didn't make me feel any better about almost dying for a bunch of toys. We stood there for a while looking at the ruins before she drove me back to the station. The command staff was waiting in the conference room with a whole panel of people I'd never seen before. They started asking about my decision to go back in after the woman mentioned her family and whether I'd followed all the protocols. I explained that we couldn't just ignore someone saying their family was trapped, even if the situation seemed weird. They kept pushing about whether I'd done a proper risk assessment before the second entry. I went through every step we'd taken and every safety measure we'd followed. The questions went on for 2 hours, with them picking apart every choice we'd made. Finally, they brought in Mallory Hansen, who was going to run what they called a critical incident stress debriefing for everyone who'd been there. The whole crew gathered in the break room, and she started talking about normal reactions to abnormal situations. Some of the guys tried to make jokes about it being no big deal, but I noticed their hands shaking when they picked up their coffee cups. Hensley kept bouncing his leg under the table, and Kirk wouldn't make eye contact with anyone. Walker sat next to me, but we didn't talk about what happened in the basement. Mallory had us go around and share what we remembered, but most guys kept it short and basic. She gave us all these handouts about recognizing stress symptoms and when to get help. The session lasted an hour, but it felt like 3, with everyone just wanting to get out of there. After it was over, the captain pulled me aside and said I should think about taking some time off. I told him I was fine, but he said that was exactly what someone who wasn't fine would say. The drive home was quiet, and I kept the radio off because every sound reminded me of those crying dolls. The next morning, I woke up to my phone buzzing with texts from guys at the station telling me to check the news. Channel 7 had our story as their lead with this stupid headline about firefighters risking their lives for a doll family, and they kept replaying footage of us being carried out of the house. The reporter stood in front of the burned ruins, talking about the bizarre discovery while making it sound like we were idiots who couldn't tell the difference between real people and toys. I turned it off and threw the remote across the room. That night, I couldn't sit still in my apartment and kept walking from room to room checking every smoke detector battery, even though I'd just changed them all last month. Every car door slamming outside made me jump, and when the heater kicked on, I nearly hit the ceiling. My body wouldn't calm down no matter how many times I told myself I was safe at home. Around 2 in the morning, Catherine called saying she'd been at the scene all day and had some preliminary findings about how the fire started. She explained that it looked like someone had left rags soaked in paint thinner near the dryer vent, and the heat from the dryer ignited them, which spread to a pile of newspapers, stacked against the wall. No signs of arson or accelerants, just really bad housekeeping and worse luck with the timing. 3 days later, I had to go back to the hospital for a follow-up chest x-ray to make sure my lungs were clearing properly. I was waiting for the elevator when I felt someone grab my arm and turned to see the woman from the fire standing there in a hospital gown. She looked right at me with these desperate eyes and asked if I'd saved the baby, and her fingers dug into my arm hard enough to hurt. I couldn't move or speak, because what do you say to someone asking about a melted doll like it was their actual child? A nurse came over and gently pulled her away, saying she needed to get back to her room for medication. Later that afternoon, a psychiatrist named Yusuf Roland called me at home and explained he was treating the woman and wanted to give me some context about what we'd encountered. He told me she'd lost her husband and 2 kids in a car accident 5 years ago when a drunk driver hit them head-on while she was at work. The dolls started as a grief thing where she'd buy ones that looked like her kids, but then it got worse and she started treating them like they were real. Hearing that made my anger turn into this uncomfortable feeling in my stomach, because now I understood why she'd been so desperate for us to save them. Catherine had me come to her office the next week to listen to the enhanced audio from our body cameras where she'd isolated just the crying sounds. When she played it back, you could hear the mechanical pattern repeating every 12 seconds, exactly with this tinny speaker quality that no human voice would have. My brain understood it was just a recording, but my body still tensed up hearing those sounds again. The RIT team leader stopped by the station to walk us through what they'd found when they analyzed the structure after the fire. He showed us photos of the basement stairs which had been eaten through by termites and dry rot for years, with the fire just being the final thing that made them collapse. We were lucky we only fell 8 feet into the basement, instead of dropping another 10 feet through the rotted floor into the crawl space underneath, where we definitely wouldn't have made it out. That weekend, I finally dealt with my gear from that night, which had been sitting in a plastic bag in my garage. The smell of smoke hit me the second I opened it, and even after 3 washes, the fabric still reeked like burning plastic and chemicals. I stood there for 20 minutes holding my helmet before I finally threw everything in the trash, because keeping it felt like holding on to poison. Catherine sent me her report documenting 17 different code violations at that house, including blocked exits and improper storage of flammable chemicals and old citations from 2 years ago that nobody ever followed up on. She was pushing the city to actually enforce these violations before more houses turned into death traps, but we both knew nothing would change until someone actually died. Risk Management scheduled me for an interview about the incident and spent 3 hours asking me to justify every single decision we'd made from the second we arrived on scene. They wanted exact times for when we entered and when the stairs collapsed and why we didn't wait for more backup, and whether we'd done a proper size-up before the second entry. Their questions felt like accusations that we'd screwed up somehow, even though we'd followed every protocol and saved the only actual person in that house. I answered everything they asked, but hated how they turned our split-second choices into spreadsheet data, like we'd had time to run a cost-benefit analysis while hearing what we thought were dying kids. 2 nights later, my phone rang at 3 in the morning, and Walker's name lit up the screen. I answered, and heard him breathing heavy on the other end, before he finally said he couldn't stop dreaming about being buried alive under burning wood. We stayed on the phone for an hour while he described waking up in cold sweats and checking his bedroom ceiling over and over to make sure it wasn't falling. Neither of us mentioned the department counselor at first, but eventually we both admitted we needed to talk to someone who actually knew how to deal with this stuff. The next morning, Mallory called me into her office at the station and suggested I take temporary light duty while I processed everything. I sat there shaking my head and telling her I was fine to work regular shifts, but she pulled out a folder with my medical reports and pointed to where the doctor noted elevated heart rate and blood pressure during my last checkup. She reminded me that pushing through trauma without dealing with it just makes everything worse later, when your body finally crashes. I left her office with paperwork for modified duty starting the next week. Catherine stopped by my apartment that afternoon with a stack of witness statements she'd collected from the neighborhood. She spread them out on my kitchen table and showed me reports from 3 different neighbors who'd seen the woman eating dinner with her dolls every single night at exactly 6 o'clock. One neighbor described hearing her singing lullabies through the open windows on summer evenings and watching her tuck the dolls into actual beds she'd set up in what used to be her kids' rooms. Another statement mentioned the woman pushing a baby carriage with dolls inside it around the block every morning, like she was taking real children for a walk. The woman actually grabbed him at the hospital asking if he saved the baby. That's really unsettling. I wonder how long she's been unable to separate those dolls from reality, if she's still calling them her baby even after the fire. The details painted this picture of someone so lonely and broken that reality just stopped making sense to her. I picked up the local paper the next day and found an opinion piece on page 4 questioning whether firefighters should risk their lives based on unverified information from someone who was clearly not mentally stable. The writer suggested we should have done a more thorough assessment before re-entering a compromised structure for what turned out to be toys. Reading those words made my hands shake, because this person sitting safe at their desk had no idea what it felt like hearing those crying sounds and believing real people needed help. The captain knocked on my door that evening and asked if he could come in for a minute. He sat on my couch and told me the board would be reviewing our incident next month, but he wanted me to know he fully supported every decision Walker and I made that night. He said he would have done the exact same thing given what we knew at the time, and he'd be telling the board that in his official statement. His backing helped, but I still felt sick thinking about sitting in front of a panel of people picking apart our choices. A week into light duty, I drove to the burned lot one evening when nobody else was around. Standing there looking at the blackened foundation, I felt my chest getting tight and my breathing going shallow just like that night. I started using the grounding techniques Mallory had taught me, counting 5 things I could see, 4 I could touch, 3 I could hear, 2 I could smell, 1 I could taste. My hands stopped shaking after a few minutes, and I actually managed to take deep breaths without feeling like I was suffocating. Catherine called me the next morning excited about something she'd discovered during her investigation. She'd taken one of the dolls to a tech expert who found a modified toy voice recorder wired inside with a heat sensor that triggered the playback when temperatures reached a certain point. The recording was a 30-second loop of baby crying that had been copied and layered to sound like multiple voices. She explained how the heat from the fire activated multiple dolls at once, creating that sophisticated crying effect we'd heard in the basement. Knowing the technical explanation behind it removed that last weird feeling that maybe something supernatural had happened that night. The fire marshal's office sent out a department-wide training bulletin 2 weeks later, using our incident as a case study. They focused on recognizing hoarding dangers and understanding how heat can trigger unexpected sounds from electronics and toys during structure fires. The bulletin included photos from the scene and technical diagrams showing how the doll mechanisms worked. Reading through it, I felt like maybe our experience could prevent another crew from going through the same thing. That night, I sat at my desk and started writing a letter to the woman, explaining what we'd found in her basement and why we couldn't save her family. I wrote about understanding loss and how sometimes our brains create different realities to protect us from pain that feels impossible to survive. I described the dolls arranged at their dinner table and how we'd risked everything to reach them because we believed they were real. I wrote 3 pages before I realized I'd never send it, but the exercise helped me separate her tragedy from my own trauma. Yusuf called me the following week with an update on the woman's condition. He reported she'd be discharged to outpatient treatment within the month and wouldn't face any criminal charges since the fire was accidental and she hadn't intentionally endangered anyone. She'd be living in a supervised group home with daily therapy sessions and medication management to help her start processing her actual grief instead of living in the fantasy world she'd created. It seemed like the most reasonable outcome considering everything that had happened. Walker showed up at my apartment 3 days later carrying 2 coffees and looking tired but determined. He sat down at my kitchen table and pushed 1 coffee toward me before taking a long sip of his own. He told me he'd been thinking about stepping back from interior attack positions for a while now. I nodded and listened without trying to change his mind because we both had to find our own way through this mess. He explained how his wife had been crying every night since the incident, and his kids kept asking if Daddy was going to die at work. The way his hands shook slightly when he talked about it told me everything I needed to know about his decision. We sat there for an hour just drinking coffee and not saying much else because sometimes silence says more than words ever could. My first day back on light duty came the following Monday with a simple alarm malfunction at a strip mall. The panel showed a fault in Zone 3, which turned out to be a loose wire in the back storage room of a nail salon. I handled the reset procedure without my hands shaking or my chest getting tight, which felt like a bigger victory than it should have. The other guys on the truck treated me normal, and nobody mentioned the basement incident, which helped more than any special treatment would have. Catherine called me that afternoon, asking if I could stop by her office to review her near-final report before the board meeting. I drove over after my shift and found her surrounded by stacks of photos and witness statements organized into neat piles. She walked me through each finding, starting with the heat patterns that showed ignition near the dryer vent, where lint had built up over years. The chemical analysis revealed traces of paint thinner and other solvents on rags that had been stored too close to the heat source. She showed me diagrams of how the hoarding conditions created perfect fire spread with newspapers and magazines acting like kindling throughout the basement. Reading through her technical explanations helped me understand exactly what happened without the emotional weight of that night clouding everything. The board review happened 2 weeks later in a conference room at headquarters with 5 senior officers sitting across from me. They asked about our initial sweep procedures and why we didn't find the basement entrance during the first search. I explained how the door was blocked by boxes and furniture, which violated fire codes but wasn't visible through the smoke. They questioned our decision to re-enter based on unverified information from someone who was clearly distressed. I referenced department policy about potential victims and explained we had no way to know her mental state at that moment. They asked about the crying sounds and whether we should have recognized them as non-human. I told them about the heat and smoke affecting our perception and how realistic the recording sounded in those conditions. The panel members took notes and asked follow-up questions, but seemed satisfied with my explanations based on training and protocol. Catherine's official report came out the next week, determining accidental ignition from the dryer area combined with chemical-soaked rags as the cause. The hoarding conditions had turned what might have been a small fire into a fully involved structure fire within minutes. Reading those words brought relief that it wasn't arson or something worse, but also sadness about how preventable it all was. Simple maintenance and proper storage could have stopped this whole thing from happening. The social worker called to update me that the woman had been placed in a supervised group home after her house was condemned. She was getting daily therapy and medication management to help process her actual grief instead of living with dolls. It wasn't perfect, but she was safer now, and getting real help, which was better than before. The department rolled out new training modules the following month, focusing on hoarding indicators and basement entry protocols. They included sections on recognizing non-human sound sources during fires and how heat affects electronics and toys. Seeing our experience turned into something that could help other crews avoid the same situation gave it meaning. Walker accepted a position in the training division where he'd be teaching new recruits about fire science and safety protocols. He'd still respond to major incidents, but wouldn't be doing interior attack, which seemed like the right balance for him. His choice showed real strength because stepping back when you need to takes more courage than pushing through. I ran into one of the RIT team members at the grocery store and finally thanked him for pulling me out that night. He just nodded and said that's what they train for, but I could see he appreciated hearing it. The weight of survivor guilt had been making it hard to express gratitude, but saying those words out loud helped lift some of that burden. Mallory scheduled a one-on-one session with me to create a concrete plan for moving forward. We sat in her office and mapped out specific steps, including better sleep habits and gradual exposure to triggers. She helped me identify warning signs of panic attacks and taught me breathing exercises to use when I felt them coming on. We set up regular check-ins with other firefighters who'd been through similar incidents, which would help normalize what I was feeling. Having an actual roadmap with specific actions to take made me feel more in control than I had since that night in the basement. 3 days later at the hospital, I picked up a blank card from the gift shop and wrote just a few words inside about understanding loss. I gave it to the social worker who said she'd pass it along to the woman during her next visit. That night, I actually slept from 10 until 6 without jolting awake to phantom crying sounds or checking my apartment for smoke. My alarm went off, and I just lay there for a minute realizing I'd made it through a whole night. The woman rigged those dolls with actual voice recorders and heat sensors. That level of planning while dealing with grief makes me wonder if she knew exactly what she was doing when she called about her family being trapped. The next morning at the station, dispatch sent us out on a routine medical call for chest pains at a grocery store. I handled the assessment and loaded the patient without my hands shaking or my mind going anywhere else. The guys treated me like they always did, making the same bad jokes and complaining about the same stuff. Nobody asked if I was okay or gave me those careful looks anymore. Catherine called that afternoon asking if I'd help present at a community fire safety event next month. She wanted to share what we learned without making it into some sensational story. I agreed because maybe turning it into something educational would help me process everything better. The presentation was held in the high school auditorium with about 200 people showing up. I stood at the podium and talked about how smoke and heat can make you hear things that aren't real. I explained how our training tells us to trust our senses, but sometimes those senses get scrambled in extreme conditions. People were taking notes and asking real questions about fire safety and hoarding dangers. Halfway through my talk, I saw Walker slip in through the back door and take a seat in the last row. We made eye contact, and he gave me a small nod that said everything without words. After the presentation ended, people came up to thank us for sharing and ask more questions about smoke detectors and escape plans. Walker waited until the crowd cleared, then walked over and shook my hand before heading out. Neither of us needed to say anything about that night or what we'd been through. 2 weeks later, I drove to where the house used to stand, now just an empty lot with weeds starting to grow through the ash. I pulled out a challenge coin from my pocket, one with our department logo on it. I pressed it into the dirt near where the front door would have been and walked back to my truck. No standing around thinking about what happened or what could have been different. Just acknowledging it happened and moving on. Looking back on everything now, I get that being a hero isn't about saving everyone or having all the answers. Sometimes it's just about making it through the bad stuff and helping other people learn from what went wrong. Walker's doing better in his training role and actually seems happier teaching than he was on active duty. The woman's getting real help in her group home instead of living alone with dolls. Catherine turned our mess into better training that might save someone else. I'm back on regular duty and sleeping most nights without problems. We're all doing better than we were, and that's enough. Thanks for letting me wander through all this with you today, folks. Always nice to question things together. Take care, and I'll see you next time. Like the video. It helps more than you think.